Chapter 14. Personal Honour. The accused captain was in full flow now, and treating the court-martial board to a most unusual display of forensic skill. He justified his forwarding of the two letters by claiming that Collard's behaviour was prejudicial to Royal Oak's discipline. It caused criticism of the Admiral himself. Criticism of a superior officer was forbidden by Article 11 of the King's Regulations. The only way to stop that criticism, in Dewar's opinion, was to stop such incidents happening again. He told the court that it was paradoxical that he should now be tried for forwarding a letter criticising a superior officer when one of his main objects was to stop a recurrence of such criticism. Furthermore, even if the letters contained criticism of Collard, they went only to the Vice Admiral and Collard himself, whereas the main comment on Collard's conduct was being broadcast throughout the ship and was much more subversive of discipline. "We have heard," said Dewar, his voice strong, "the prosecution heckling witnesses as to whether they noticed any signs of dissatisfaction on the ship, whether the men drilled properly, whether they were clean, and so on. Only last night I was told that my letter was viewed as a frame-up in certain quarters, because, in actual fact, the discipline of the Royal Oak's men was proved to be quite good. Apparently some people have interpreted my letter to mean that the incidents had introduced into the ship a state of latent mutiny. The thought never entered my mind." Dewar explained that quite obviously his idea of discipline was not the same as that of the prosecutor. Dewar believed in a reciprocal relationship between all ranks, which brought about the most willing, efficient, and intelligent cooperation. Nothing was more destructive of that than the bullying and abuse of subordinates. "I have no doubt," he said pointedly, "that the court is acquainted with Article 7 of King's Regulations, which definitely forbids bullying or undeserved abuse or irritating language, especially towards inferiors." It was at this point, unfortunately, that Dewar seemed to get carried away with his argument. Goodness knows who he had been listening to back in his hotel after the court had adjourned the previous evening. But what had been said had, without any question, stirred him considerably. "There is another point I should like to mention," he went on, "which I heard from a high source last night. I heard, for the first time, that some clever people have connected my letter complaining of the effect of Admiral Collard's behaviour on discipline with the scare headlines that appeared in the press immediately after I got back here." He meant on his return to the Mediterranean fleet after he had been sent home to England. "Mutiny in the Royal Oak. Apparently they credit me with having put it in the paper. It hardly seems worthwhile denying such rubbish." Dewar then tried hard to reason with the court. "I treated the Rear Admiral as a highly honoured guest in the ship. How could I hope to maintain my authority if he attacked me in this manner? Being convinced that these incidents had to be stopped, I asked the court to consider what they would have done under the circumstances. I might have made a verbal protest, of course. I considered that. My judgment and my previous experience told me that would be ineffective. You have heard the evidence of the chaplain, and I think that confirms the soundness of my judgment. You heard him say it found it a hard time, even staying in the cabin. I knew that if I went personally to the Rear Admiral on this matter, I would merely have been bullied again. I might have gone privately to the Rear Vice Admiral or some other officer, but I don't believe in creeping up the back stairs. I don't think it is the right that any officer should go behind the back of a senior officer and carry reports of his conduct. I never mentioned any of these incidents to any officer in the fleet simply because I thought it would be an improper thing to do." Dewar said that he considered that the only course open to him was to follow King's Regulations and write a formal letter to Vice Admiral Kelly. To that effect, he consulted Daniel. "If a captain is not entitled to consult and utilise the opinion of his commander in such a matter," he protested, "how can he be held responsible for the discipline and morale of his ship?" Dewar made a confession to the court. He admitted, he said, that while he had carefully drafted and redrafted his own letter, he had not meticulously examined every word of Daniel's to see if anything was liable to be misinterpreted. "I don't think then, and I do not think now," he added, "that the form of the commander's letter was a matter of very vital importance." Dewar submitted, however, that the evidence which had been produced showed that Daniel's letter did paint a true picture of the situation. "You have heard," he argued, "the evidence of at least 4 officers on that point. The prosecution have not attempted to produce a single witness to contradict the facts stated in that letter. Do you mean to tell me that they have not tried to find officers who would say the facts and statements in these letters were untrue? Of course they have. Why have they not found officers who would tell you that the wardroom was not inflamed by indignation? Isn't that sufficient proof that it was? Perhaps it was the stony faces of the judging officers lining the table before him, or the seeming indifference to what he regarded as simple logic, but Dewar allowed some bitterness to show through his words. In view of the fact that I was ignominiously turned out of the Royal Oak, it is to be expected that I was guilty of some crime, of conspiracy, disloyalty, malice, vindictiveness, or even uncharitableness. But not one scrap of evidence has been produced by the prosecution to show that Commander Daniel and I were not loyal to the Admiral, in thought, word, and deed. In making this complaint and forwarding Commander Daniel's letter, I was actuated solely by a sense of duty. It was certainly not to my advantage to bring a complaint against my Rear Admiral. I bore no malice against him. I bear none now. I am extremely sorry for him, and I feel nothing he has done deserve this candle which this case holds to his name. At the same time, I would recall, he brought a good deal of challenges against me. Once again, Dewar referred to conversations he had had after the previous day's hearing. Whatever his brother officer friends had told him quite clearly rankled. "Only last night," he protested, "I heard from some senior officer that I am supposed to have worked with Commander Daniel to hunt Admiral Collard out of the ship. I have been told other things which, if true, would be a disgrace to the uniform I wear. I know no other serious charges have been brought against me about which I know nothing. I now, for the first time, understand why I was sent home in disgrace. I can only vaguely guess the object of such rumours, but I would ask the court to think that, in actual fact, I am not very different from themselves, and unless real evidence is produced to the contrary, I ask them to credit me with the same sense of honesty and decency as themselves." Dewar went on to argue the technical weaknesses of the case against him. He made many points. One of them concerned the charge against him which referred to Daniel's letter as being subversive of discipline. Dewar wanted to know exactly whose discipline was being subverted. Was it his personally, for it was to him that Daniel handed the letter, or was it that of Vice Admiral Kelly, who was to receive it? And as far as he was accused of passing on the letter, it was, he put to the court, an analogous case. "Supposing," he said, "a lieutenant of one of your ships wrote a letter to the commander complaining that you, the captain, had misconducted yourself in some way, and stating that your behaviour had inflamed the officers and men with indignation. He gives it to the commander, and tells him definitely that he wants it forwarding to you. And supposing the commander did forward it, I put it to you, not one captain here would think of court-martialling or even censuring the commander for merely forwarding that letter. And so far as the charge is concerned, that is what I am accused of." Dewar ended his long address with a most impassioned plea. "I was ignominiously turned out of my ship and sent home without knowing what I had done wrong. After 30 years, my character and reputation had been ruined without any charge against me. I pressed for a court-martial and, presumably because there was no evidence, I am now before you on the trivial charge of not having sufficiently censored a letter. I submit that there is no case against me. A great principle of justice is involved. I ask the court not only to acquit me, but to acquit me honourably, as this case is one which affects my personal honour." It was 6 o'clock in the evening before Dewar sat down again. It might have been a very fine speech, one that would have carried much weight before an ordinary judge and jury, and as a dissertation on the principles of discipline, would then be greeted as thought-provoking at a staff college lecture. But it cut little ice with his fellow officers sitting in judgment. They had it firmly fixed in their minds that there would have been no need for all this court-martial nonsense, speechifying and publicity, if Dewar had only had the common sense to tell Commander Daniel to rephrase his letter and to have had a quiet and confidential word with some senior officer. Anyway, it was too late now, and it was time for the court to adjourn once more so that Rear Admiral Boyle could prepare his reply for the prosecution. This took some while, and when Boyle finally rose he had hardly spoken a few words before, on the rain-swept deck, the bugles rang out for the ritual of sunset. The whole court, accused and spectators, rose and stood facing the quarterdeck and waited in silence as a limp white ensign was hauled slowly down. The interruption over, Boyle's speech turned out to be brief. He pointed out that it was Dewar himself who had asked to be court-martialed. He then went on to complain that the prosecution had been placed at a definite disadvantage because, throughout most of the case, the defence had been allowed to introduce matters that had nothing to do with the charges. Boyle argued that Collard's behaviour was irrelevant to either of the two charges brought against Dewar. What is more, he was not going to refer to it. The mass of evidence on detail should not be allowed to fog the issue, and the plea of justification on which the defence largely rested was itself a tacit admission that the offences had been committed. Every unfounded rumour regarding the incidents had been exploited, and many unfair and untrue innuendos had been made. The Rear Admiral had found fault, as he had a perfect right to do, when he discovered that his orders had not been carried out. The method of his fault-finding might, or might not, be open to question. Boyle closed his address by saying that the notoriety of the trial might well have been avoided by more deliberate reflection by the accused at the time of the incidents. The moment for judgment had come. Dewar had called for the court-martial, and now he would see if his gamble with his career had succeeded. Spectators, press, witnesses. Dewar himself and the advocates were once more turned out of the hangar to find what shelter they could from the driving rain. They were kept waiting less than half an hour. When they returned, their eyes turned automatically to the accused's sword lying on the table. The point was toward him. Only Dewar appeared not to notice. He took his place, stiff and tight-lipped. Among the spectators, Mrs. Dewar cried a little, but very quietly. It turned out to be a most unsatisfactory verdict. Dewar had been found guilty of the first charge of forwarding a letter whose contents were subversive of discipline, but he was acquitted on the second of forwarding a letter containing criticism of Collard's conduct and his orders. Dewar declined to say anything in mitigation, but merely handed in his certificates. These were even more impressive than Daniel's. They dated back to 1896. Two captains wrote of his bright promise as a midshipman. Zealous was the word most often used to describe him as a lieutenant. He was a gunnery officer of the highest attainment and deserved quick promotion. One captain described him as an officer of excellent judgment who will do well in the higher ranks of the service. As Dewar rose to commander and then to captain, so the prayers continued. But those certificates did nothing to sway the court's sentence. Dewar was dismissed his ship and severely reprimanded. It must have been a morose group of the Dewars, Daniels, and the lawyer who dined that miserable Maundy Thursday in Gibraltar's second-best hotel. Sad save, perhaps, for Dewar himself. He was far too angry at the way Boyle and the prosecution had conducted the case and felt that he had been very hardly done by. For him, the fight was by no means over. Meanwhile, back in England, where there had been so much excitement at the goings-on in Royal Oak, the population had something more important on its mind, the Easter holiday. As in Gibraltar, the weather had been appalling. Now the weather forecast promised better things. Sunshine was forecast for the whole of the British Isles, with only a cautionary note that the rain from Spain and the bad weather from Gibraltar might work its way across Europe. Already, Weston-super-Mare had a temperature of 60 degrees Fahrenheit. There were traffic jams on the coast roads, and the railway stations were doing good business. But the real sensation was a number of people deciding to spend the weekend in Paris. Imperial Airways, flying from London's Old Air Terminal at Croydon, had never had such an experience. Its biplanes were taxed to their fullest extent. The company was laying its hands on any aircraft that could be found. There were even cases of customers booking in advance. On the Thursday, the usual 3 aircraft had been sufficient, but on Good Friday, an unheard of 7 were needed. Between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m., the unprecedented total of 85 passengers had been flown across the Channel. Another 82 were expected the next day. Commercial flying was catching on. Britain was off on holiday. London Zoo, expecting a crowd and dubious about the weather forecast, had laid down new asphalt paths to avoid muddy feet, and suddenly, nobody had much time for the fate of quarrelsome naval officers. Even the Mediterranean fleet seemed to have lost interest. All through the day, while Dewar had been making his fervent appeal to the court-martial, while decisions were being made and sentence passed, the ships of the fleet had been working their way to the outer bay. The flagship Queen Elizabeth, Warspite, Ramillies, Valiant, Resolution, and even Royal Oak herself, all the great battleships had left their harbour berths. During the night they sailed, 5 days late, for their appointment in Barcelona. It was very much a silent service once again. The Navy had had its fill of newspaper headlines, and what went on when an admiral fell out with a bandmaster. When Collard, Dewar and Daniel rose from their respective beds the next morning, the Navy had left them behind, and for all they knew, for good. Chapter 15. Why, it's old Dewar. There was no purpose in any of the 3 naval officers or their families remaining a moment longer in Gibraltar than they need. The first thing that they did was to investigate liner sailings home. Collard booked a cabin aboard the Orient Line's yellow-funnelled, 20,000-ton Otranto, homeward bound from Australia and sailing the following Sunday. Dewar, Daniel and their wives arranged a passage home on the same day, but, deliberately or otherwise, decided to sail in P&O's Ranpura, back from India on her way to London. Life for the next couple of days in that small social circle, particularly with the fleet away, must have been difficult. but somehow the Rear Admiral and his two former officers managed to avoid meeting each other. Then, on the Sunday morning, when they were all due to leave Gibraltar, Collard performed a characteristically unpredictable act. Seizing some of the hotel writing paper, he wrote a separate note to Dewar and Daniel, saying he would like to meet them once more before leaving and inviting them round to the hotel where he was staying. He made sure that both letters were instantly delivered by messenger. Dewar responded straight away. He immediately strode round to the Bristol Hotel. It was just about 9:30 a.m. when he arrived. Collard, who was sitting in the lounge reading a newspaper, leapt to his feet, extended his hand in greeting, and, with a broad smile, cried, "Why, it's old Dewar!" The two officers settled themselves down to a long chat, right until it was time for Collard to think about leaving for the harbour and boarding his liner. They shook hands sociably again on parting. "So long, old man," said Collard. "Good luck," replied Dewar. Their meeting was not unobserved. When the news reached the London newspapers, there was many a sentimental editorial pen. Soon the public were to read how the indomitable spirit of the British, and particularly of the Royal Navy, had shone through. Good and honest men who bore no grudge nor malice in victory or defeat. Although it is far more likely that it was just another example of Collard's ebullient nature, equally ready with a smile as with a scowl. Unhappily for Daniel, he had been out of the hotel when his invitation arrived. As soon as he saw it, he too sped to the Bristol Hotel, but by that time Collard, his luggage, and his entourage had departed. All that the commander could do was to find some writing paper and leave a note of Godspeed to be forwarded. The Rear Admiral's arrival in England passed quite unnoticed. Not so that of Dewar. When the Rampura berthed in London's King George V docks, quite a crowd had assembled. Dewar and Daniel, both in plain clothes, managed to slip ashore quietly, but stevedores, porters, and crane drivers came running to Dewar's car. They mobbed it and then sent it on its way to a rousing cheer. Why he should have suddenly become some sort of public hero is hard to say, and the captain was certainly not the man to want, let alone encourage, such a demonstration. Yet there it was and faithfully reported. It could not have done his cause any harm at all when the Admiralty read its newspapers, and, judging by a leading article in the Times that appeared only 2 days after his court-martial, he was going to need all the help he could get. Predominant over every opinion about the week's proceedings in court-martial at Gibraltar, and about the incidents in which they originated, it fulminated, will be a sense of relief and thankfulness that they are ended. An episode that has profited no public or private interest and remains devoid of significance for the life, organisation, and discipline of the Navy. Regret and astonishment sharpened by impatience that the elaborate ceremonial and procedure of naval justice should have been engaged by things of so little moment. We have Commander Daniel's own straightforward admission that it was a peculiar letter and that he exceeded orders. This peculiar letter Captain Dewar forwarded to the Vice Admiral and admits that he did not disapprove it. Rear Admiral Collard, before the trials were instituted, had already been relieved from his command, a penalty which must be without parallel in the recent history of the Navy. The immediate upshot is that the careers of 3 officers of high professional competence have been interrupted, if not broken altogether, a result which again adds to the debits of this most unprofitable affair. An admiral too much given to the choleric word, served by officers too dour or too zealous to keep the passing moment in reasonable perspective. Too little gravity on one side and too much solemnity on the other. Such seems to be the summary of an episode which has brought the Navy under the humiliating glare of unmerited publicity, which has made some ignominious and unusual events aboard one ship in the Mediterranean fleet a topic for the world's discussion. Everyone who knows the corporate spirit of the service and the jealousy with which its good name is guarded will also know what it has had to endure and the indignities to which a malign chain of occurrences has brought upon it through no ascertainable fault of its own. If the Times and the Admiralty both felt that it was for the moment for the Royal Oak and her courts-martial to be swept under the nearest carpet, then they had no ally in Captain Dewar. It is clear that Dewar did not regard his passage home from Gibraltar as a restful cruise after the strain of the court-martial. For the very day he landed from the liner, Rampura, he filed off a 7-page, closely typed letter to the Admiralty, raising argumentative point after argumentative point, and with copious footnotes. He also protested strongly about the manner in which the courts-martial had been conducted. During the first trial, he wrote, the Deputy Judge Advocate was conspicuous in his efforts to prevent the disclosure of relevant facts. His apparent bias against the defence was a subject of general comment, and despite the dangers of such criticisms, the Times remarked on his attempt to dominate the court and counsel. That afternoon, a certain gentleman, whose name can, if desired, be given in confidence, warned the Commander-in-Chief Secretary that the attitude of the Deputy Judge Advocate was playing straight into the hands of the Labour Party, who would be closely watching the case. During my trial, the Deputy Judge Advocate was much more careful, but he made a remark to my counsel, not reported in the minutes, indicating that the words "tending to bring into contempt" had been omitted from the second charge in order to secure a conviction. This indicated either an ignorance of legal procedure or a distinct bias towards conviction. Dewar's letter ended by accusing the Deputy Judge Advocate of prejudicing the case and failing to show impartiality. Enough work for one's first day on setting foot back in England? Not at all. The moment Dewar's car took him home to Kent, he was at his typewriter again. The letter reads, Branksome, Sevenoaks, 12th of April, 1928. Sir, with reference to the statement alleged to have been made by me in the Evening Standard of Monday, April 9th, I have the honour to report that I have made no statement, nor have I granted any interview on the subject of the recent court-martial. I did, however, on the day after the court-martial, say to the Times correspondent that I regretted the scandal which has brought this case on the Navy, and that I hoped it would be allowed to die down as soon as possible. I have the honour to be your obedient servant, K. Dewar. The Secretary of the Admiralty, copies to the Naval Secretary, First Sea Lord and Second Sea Lord. Sometimes the Admiralty has occasion to sigh. On Monday morning, 16th April 1928, the Board of Admiralty met. They were attended by the head of the Naval Legal Department and the Judge Advocate of the Fleet. The only subject on the agenda was a review of the Royal Oaks Court-Martial. It was quite sufficient. C. M. Pitman, K.C., the Judge Advocate, had by this time studied the minutes of the courts-martial and also Dewar's letter. His report to the board was enlightening. He said that he still felt the doubts that he had held originally about the second charge against Dewar and the equivalent charge in Daniel's case. It was his opinion that the court-martial board was right to acquit Dewar in this instance. Consequently, it must be held that the same charge against Daniel was not satisfactorily proved. The question of the sentences gave him much more anxiety, for they were in due form and within the power of the courts. The accused, he reported, appeared to me to have conducted the defence on most injudicious lines. They insisted on cross-examining the Rear Admiral and on tendering evidence which involved the court in an inquiry into the whole of the surrounding circumstances. They made it their object to convince the courts that their whole attitude towards the Admiral was justified, and it may well be that the courts, without so intending, really punished them for the way in which they conducted their defence, rather than for the actual offences of which they were convicted. There can be no doubt that the conduct of the Rear Admiral was very bad, and when these proceedings were instituted, I thought that a skilful and respectful defence would say, we were quite entitled to make complaints of such intolerable conduct, and if our complaint did go beyond what was right, it was a technical offence which we regret. I anticipated that such a defence would result in a reprimand or possibly in an acquittal. Although Dewar and Daniel would have been in no mood to admit it at the time, the Judge Advocate of the Fleet was turning out to be their own very best advocate. He went on. Now that the accused have insisted on and obtained a full inquiry into the whole of their conduct in relation to the Rear Admiral, the question remains as to whether they ought to suffer the full consequence of a sentence which appears to me to be based on their whole conduct, including the conduct of their defence, rather than on the offences which they have been convicted. From a legal point of view, there is no fault to be found with the sentences, but I have found it right to point out to their lordships that there is sufficient ground, should they see fit, for some modification of the sentences or of their effect on the future of these officers. It was right, he added, that Collard should have been cross-examined. The Advocate General, the Royal Navy's chief legal adviser, ended his memorandum. I would suggest that the whole machinery for making and forwarding complaints should be reconsidered. The King's regulations and Admiralty instructions should make it clear what a letter of complaint should and should not contain, so as to remove from the service any idea that to complain of a real grievance against a superior officer is to court disaster. After so much food for thought, their lordships were then presented with another memorandum and a very different point of view. It was from Sir Oswin Murray, KCB, Secretary to the Navy, and was concerned with the sentences passed on to the two officers. It included the phrase, "The procedure of complaint would be impossible in a disciplined service if the right to complain gave the inferior a right to write whatever he liked about his superior. There is a line to be drawn somewhere between what is inadmissible and what may be overlooked, and this line does not seem to have been drawn with undue strictness in the case of Commander Daniel. If the court-martial sentence on Commander Daniel be confirmed, the question remains whether any further decision, e.g. as to not employing him any further, shall be taken and announced. Many people might feel that Commander Daniel is, to some extent, the victim of Captain Dewar's unfortunate exercise of his discretion. The memorandum was considerably stiffer concerning Dewar's behaviour. One of the main reasons why a commanding officer is given discretion as to how he will deal with a letter of complaint received is in order that he may provide guidance to a less experienced inferior regarding his action and prevent him from infringing the regulations or putting himself in a false position. Where, as in this case, the commanding officer himself and his junior officer had common grounds for complaint against the Rear Admiral. It is thought that the proper course would have been for the commanding officer to deter his junior from voicing these complaints at all, and to take the whole matter upon his own shoulders. He should then have made personal representations to the Rear Admiral, using his utmost efforts not to promote a rupture, but to restore harmony. Dewar's views on the wisdom of making personal representations to Collard about virtually anything at all were well known to anybody who had heard the evidence in court. The Secretary's memorandum went on. Captain Dewar, on the contrary, encouraged Commander Daniel to include a strong complaint, and then enclosed this with the more guarded statement of complaints which he himself put forward, thus, in a way, using his junior officer as a cat's paw. He, Dewar, showed a fixed determination to promote a rupture, which seems difficult to excuse, seeing that the fleet was due to leave for important exercises, the success of which should have been the thought uppermost in the minds of all keen officers. And, to show how quickly gossip travels, the Naval Secretary added another reason for what he regarded as Dewar's lack of logical reason for the action he took by referring to that handshake between Collard and his captain in the Bristol Hotel in Gibraltar on the Sunday morning after the courts-martial, as he described it in that memorandum to their lordships. Quite a short interview since the court-martial, he wrote, is said to have been quite effective in re-establishing good relations between the two officers. Sir Oswald Murray raised the question as to whether Dewar should be employed by the Navy any longer, or should be put on the retired list. Murray's opinion was that there was considerable justification for retiring Dewar as unfit for further employment, but he did warn their lordships that if they took such a step then they must expect something of a public outcry. By now, both Dewar and Daniel were on half £1 15s and 3p a day in the captain's case, and £1 and 8 a day for the commander. But Collard was still receiving his full income. This was due to the fact that he was still on foreign service leave. When the board met that Monday morning, his leave had still another 6 days to run. Oswald Murray told their lordships that this fact was probably the reason that the public and the press felt that he had received no punishment. It is understood, Murray reported, that the First Sea Lord is of the opinion that the defects of temper and lack of self-control shown by Rear Admiral Collard make it impossible to employ him further as a flag officer. He went on to suggest there were 3 options open to the board: to put Collard on the half-pay list and leave him there with no further action, to allow him to retire voluntarily, or to retire him. In Murray's view, the choice lay between either of the first 2 courses. He added his memorandum. In view of the objectionable comments made in this country and abroad, it is for the consideration whether any statement made should not include an expression of astonishment that, in this case, there should have been such an unaccountable absence amongst officers of high rank of the good temper and level-headedness usually found amongst all ranks and ratings. After studying the memorandum, the board then displayed that it had a mind of its own. Collard's behaviour, they decided, was the principal factor in the whole affair. He was to be sacked forthwith. One of the charges against Daniel had been brought wrongly, but the other 3 officers merited the sentence that had been given, and it should stand. Dewar's sentence, too, should be confirmed. However, the lordships unanimously agreed that, by this ratification of sentence on the 2 officers, they had sufficiently marked their sense of disapproval of their conduct. They decided that neither man should be precluded from further employment when a vacancy arose. Finally, they would review King's regulations and Admiralty instructions to see if there were grounds for amending the procedure of complaining about the conduct of a superior officer. This was in fact done, though, as one might well expect, the modification took a long time and considerable argument. So when that Monday morning board meeting was over, it was clear that Collard had suffered by far the most severe punishment, a fate that the Rear Admiral must always have feared, however bold a face he had always worn. The Admiralty's next step was downright brutal. A letter was dispatched that very same day to Vine Cottage, Collard's home in the Surrey village of Whitley. Sir, my Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty have carefully considered the reports of the circumstances which recently led to your being relieved of your command as Rear Admiral, 1st Battle Squadron, as well as the minutes of the courts-martial held at Gibraltar, upon the conduct of the Captain and Commander, HMS Royal Oak, on that occasion. The review of all the facts leaves their Lordships in no doubt that these regrettable incidents were largely occasional by lack of self-control and peculiarity of temper on your part. They have accordingly decided to place you on the retired list as from 22nd of April, under the provisions of the Order of Council of the 21st of April 1922, copy of which is enclosed. Even though the wording might have been typical in its style to any government department of that time, or of any time come to that, it was a particularly cruel farewell letter. Whatever faults Collard possessed, he had given 40 loyal years of his life to the Royal Navy, had risen to high rank, and had shown himself a very gallant officer. But there was no reference to any of this, nor even a single word of regret. Collard never, from that day forward, right up until the day he died, expressed one single word in public of anger, justification, or indignation. Instead, on the morning he received the letter, he behaved exactly as one might have expected. He packed his wife and baggage into his car, locked up his house, and drove away to privacy and an unknown address. No confounded reporters were going to ask him questions. Good friends, and he had those, kept his destination secret. The theory is that he went off to the solitude of fly fishing, in which case the trout needed all the help that heaven could send them. After the Admiralty Board adjourned its meeting, it had 2 days of slightly less to prepare a statement for the First Lord, the Right Honourable William Bridgeman, to deliver at question time to an extremely inquisitive House of Commons the following Wednesday afternoon. When he arrived at the House and took his seat, those two champions of the Navy, Commander Bellairs, the Tory, and Lieutenant Commander Kenworthy, for Labour, were eagerly awaiting him. Bellairs opened fire by asking him if, in future, the Admiralty would insist on 24 hours' notice of a court of inquiry being given. Bridgeman waffled some sort of reply that explained precisely nothing. Bellairs persisted. Was the right honourable gentleman aware that Commander Daniel had stated that he had only 10 minutes to collect evidence for his court of inquiry? Bridgeman said he would deal with that in his answer to the next question. That question came from Kenworthy. He wanted to know whether Bridgeman had any statement to make concerning the courts-martial of Dewar and Daniel, and whether those two officers had received new appointments. Bridgeman then, for the first time, announced to Parliament and the country the decisions the Board of Admiralty had reached 2 days earlier. Collard had been retired. The sentences passed on Dewar and Daniel would stand, but they would be considered for future employment when an opportunity arose. When he had finished, Kenworthy rose again. When the right honourable gentleman speaks of further employment for these officers, he asked, am I to understand that that means further employment at sea? And is he aware that in the case of an officer of the rank of Captain Dewar, unless he gets in his sea time, further promotion in the service is denied to him, and that it would therefore be possible for the Admiralty to employ him on shore and to cut short his career in a higher rank? Bridgeman replied that he was well aware of the situation, but he could not give an undertaking that Dewar would be employed because the number of vacancies was limited. At last, a highly intrigued nation, which, apart from its Easter holiday, had been following the story of the Rear Admiral, the Captain, the Commander, and the Bandmaster with ardent interest, had heard the whole story. The first wild rumours of mutiny, the court-martial evidence, and now the confirmation of the sentences. Bridgeman's statement to the House of Commons was the highlight of that day's parliamentary business. Waiting in the wings to be introduced as a new member for Linlithgow was a certain Mr. Emmanuel Shinwell, who one day would become Father of the House. The press totally ignored the arrival of Mr. Shinwell, but it had much to say about the Bridgeman statement. The Times' leading article growled, "One regret will linger obstinately upon a stage otherwise empty. I regret that the steam hammer should ever have been allowed to engage the nut." Reynolds' Illustrated News, a left-wing Sunday newspaper which always bore over its leader columns the imposing, if not exactly original slogan, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people," started off its main leader. Mr. Bridgeman is a gentleman with whose sayings and dealings Reynolds rarely finds itself in complete agreement. The statement of the First Lord of the Admiralty as to the review of the Royal Oak's court-martial, however, provides the exception that proves the rule. We congratulate the Admiralty on the way in which it has dealt with the affair, If the matter had been in our own hands, we should not have acted differently. The People, also an opposition newspaper, took a rather more scathing attitude. It is to be hoped, its leader writer said rather nastily, that the Navy generally will have learned from the Royal Oak incidents how very unwise it is for all concerned to wash soiled linen in public. The News of the World took a different line. Thus ends, it remarked, the storm in a teacup. Such a storm as will occasionally blow while ships are operated by men and not by angels. Fiction has familiarized us with a world in which seamen add little colour to life afloat by the use of language barred from young ladies' schools. Fact seems, in this respect, to square pretty closely with fiction. What concerns the public is that the discipline of the fleet is as a rock, unshaken and unshakable as Gibraltar itself. Every one of these leading articles was carefully cut out, studied and filed by an Admiralty at once rueful, red-faced, and fervently wishing that Royal Oak and all mention of her and her officers had never been. Almost pathetically, every even halfway kind word about the First Lord of the Admiralty was heavily underlined. Then, 2 days after Bridgeman had made his statement to the House of Commons, and the service was beginning to believe that all would soon be forgotten, Commander Daniel chose to make a public announcement. He had decided to leave the Navy.